The US is by far the biggest oil producer globally, producing more than Saudi Arabia and Russia combined. Yet, despite this, a key tenet of the Trump administration is still to
drill, baby, drill,
and make the US even a bigger contributor to oil production than it already is.
American energy dominance.
But the interesting thing here is that rather we're talking about the Obama, Trump or Biden administration, the US oil industry continued to grow at roughly the same pace over the past 15 years. As a matter of fact, under Biden, oil production in the US grew at a slightly quicker rate than under the first Trump administration. Anyhow, three things we are discussing today. Firstly, what are the Trump administration's plans for oil production? Secondly, how feasible are those plans actually? How likely are they to be implemented and materialized? And lastly, what does all of this mean concretely for US oil production over the next couple of years? How much more or less can we expect? Enough talking from my side, only to get more talking. My name is Philip, this is Commodities Corner. Let's get going. So before getting into Trump's plan specifically, just to put the US industry a little bit into context, as we saw, US super mega ultra large producer about 22 million barrels per day, which is roughly equal to 22% of global oil production, or about as much as Russia and Saudi Arabia combined. Now, as a side note here, sometimes you'll see the number 13 to 14 million barrels per day for the US. And that number refers to just crude oil production, whereas the higher number of 20 to 22 million barrels per day refers to crude oil plus natural gas liquids, with natural gas liquids being a form of very light oil that comes from gas production and for which the US is by far the largest producer globally. So when it comes to concrete plans from the Trump administration on oil production, there are not that many beyond drill, baby, drill. The main one would be from the beautiful Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who put forward the 3-3-3 plan, which basically meant that we want debt to be cut to 3% of GDP, 3% annual growth, and we want to add 3 million barrels per day of oil or oil and gas up to 2028. Now, we only care about the latter statement, the 3 million barrels per day. And here, as a side note, you find different specifications depending on a news source. Some say 3 million barrels of just oil, others refer to oil and gas. In this video, we're going to play with both assumptions. We're going to assume that either all 3 million barrels per day come from oil, and we're also going to play with the assumption of only half of it comes from oil, the other half would be gas. Either way, so the main target would be 1.5 to 3 million barrels per day of additional oil production between 2025 and 2028. But you see, this target is not really that ambitious. If, for example, we take forecasts for the US oil industry that were published before Trump came to power, before Trump was elected, earlier in 2024, such as the oil market outlook of the International Energy Agency, we can see that there the IEA predicted or forecasted production growth of about 2.1 million barrels per day between 2024 and 2030 for the US, which would be roughly equal to 300,000 barrels per day each year, which is slightly less than the 375,000 barrels per day that we would get at the lower end of Bessent's target, but it's a relatively minimal difference considering that the forecast was made then under the Biden administration technically, and that, well, if you take Trump's rhetoric, it sounds more like he really wants to overhaul the oil industry. Put it even into a different light, if we compare the annual growth rate of the higher end of the 750,000 barrels per day to what has historically happened over the past 15 years, we can see it's structurally lower really than under any other administration, including the Biden one. So how likely is it that the Trump administration can actually attain its goal of increasing oil production by 1.5 to 3 million barrels per day up to 2028? Well, very simply put, not that likely. So firstly, it's not the US government that dictates oil production, but that's still just the oil companies. At best, the US government can facilitate or obstruct where oil production is going. But at the end of the day, it's up to the largest oil companies in the US or oil companies in the US in general, such as an ExxonMobil, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, Occidental, EOG Resources, Devon Energies, BP, etc. It's up to them to decide where oil production is heading. And the US oil industry really is not keen on increasing its oil production. For example, the head of upstream oil at ExxonMobil has already cited later on in autumn 2024 that just because Trump comes into power, it does not mean that everybody is going to be in drill baby drill mode. Rather, it has to make financially sense. And right now, it does not make financially sense. So 3 reasons for that really specifically. Now, they all are tied to the supply-demand balance, meaning if we have oversupply, it leads to oil prices crashing, or if we have the sentiment oversupply. And right now, really, a lot of things point toward the market being and continuing to be in a situation of oversupply. So firstly, we have the IEA report of the International Energy Agency that I alluded to earlier, which also cites that by 2030, we could see global overcapacity reaching about 8 million barrels per day. That's up from 6 million barrels per day as of 2024, with a lot of additional production coming online in countries such as Guyana and Brazil in 2025, 2026, and of course still the US. Now, secondly, we have China's oil demand growth really slowing down. There may even be the potential, according to the Chinese oil company CNPC, Sinopec, that we've already reached the peak of road fuel demand in China, due to EV sales reaching 50-ish%. More on that in another video if you're curious. My link here, probably, I don't know. And thirdly, we have also OPEC pitching in right now, throwing on a lot of additional barrels on the market, which again, combined with everything else that's going on, has led to oil prices also dipping below $60 per barrel, the lowest point we've seen since April 2021. Now, as a reminder, US break even, so how much is actually needed to recoup costs, according to recent surveys, stands at an average of about $65 per barrel. So, very bluntly put, in a lot of cases it would not make financially sense. Plus the fact that we have a huge pipeline of additional projects, especially in Latin America and the Middle East up to 2030, as referred to by the IEA report. So do we really need more oil? Probably not. That will also mean that US oil companies will probably not increase their oil production. So does this mean that all of Trump's statements are just a bunch of hyperbolic fluff? Well, let's look into what he's done specifically so far. So when Trump came to office on the 20th of January earlier this year, he signed a bunch of executive orders, and there are 3 that I would point out that really pertain to energy and oil. Those are declaring a national energy emergency, unleashing American energy, and unleashing Alaska's vast resource potential. Now, to be fair, the latter 2 sound like they're taken straight from Dragon Ball Z or another anime, but they all boil down to just cutting regulations and making it easier for energy and infrastructure projects to come off the ground. Now, the biggest direct consequence for the oil and gas industry is probably not on the oil front, but on the gas front, with liquefied natural gas export terminals before being halted under the Biden administration, or the construction of new ones. And, well, this halting of the LNG projects was halted. So now you can't develop LNG terminals again, which means that it makes it easier, or it allows for more gas exports in the mid to long term. But on the oil front so far, we've seen really not much specific. Now, that said, though, there are 2 things to note from the Trump administration that could have an impact on oil production in especially the mid to long term. The first one is leases and permits. Now, as we saw earlier, oil production growth during the Biden administration happened more quickly than during the first Trump administration. But the very reason why this happened so quickly was because of the legacy or the policies of the Trump administration. Because you see, the Trump administration handed out quite a lot of oil leases, about 5 million acres compared to 250,000 acres during the Biden administration. And those leases did not have to be developed immediately, but actually could be developed at any time over the next 10 years. As a matter of fact, a lot of leases sit idle and are not being developed. But a lot of leases were handed out, were not developed immediately, but then were developed or got drill permits during the Biden administration. But so now then we have a situation where the Biden administration has really almost completely cut the amount of oil leases being handed out. So does this affect the oil production rate during the Trump administration? Can we see less of a growth because of that? Well, all of this talk about federal policies and leases probably does not really matter that much. You see, firstly, most of the land is not owned by the federal government, but by states or private entities. As a matter of fact, we're talking about anywhere between 10 to 25%, depending on the source, that's stated to be owned by the federal government. So, a relatively small share. Secondly, as already mentioned, there are a lot of leases out there that just are sitting idle, that are not being drilled. So handing out more leases probably will not make much of a difference. It's not a key bottleneck. Again, it leads back to it has to economically, financially make sense for the companies to develop those oil reserves. So to pull it all together, what can we expect concretely from the Trump administration and the oil industry over the next years? Well, very simply put, oil production growth in the US will likely slow down by a lot compared to what we've seen over the past 15 years. And the two overarching reasons for this are, one, that for oil companies right now it just does not make sense to further increase oil production by a large margin, surely not by as much as we've seen over the past 10 to 15 years. And secondly, it's also speculated that because of this strong growth rate, a lot of the most productive assets in the US have already been developed. Now, one could always speculate that new technologies, etc., may revolutionize oil production in the US or beyond. But right now, with the speculation of oil demand also peaking soon, there seems to be less of a need to cater toward those new technologies. So if you were to ask me personally, I think oil production growth rate in the US will slow down by a lot over the next 5 years and will then stagnate at around those levels for the years to come, depending of course on overall demand conditions. That's all from me for today. If you enjoyed the content, please feel free to like or subscribe. It does really help the channel. New video very soon and very regularly, and I hopefully see you in the next one. Take care.